All right, so let's get right to it. Lydia Allan is a local favorite. She's a teacher, she's a scientist, a philosopher, and an activist. With 20 years of experience, Lydia has worked in both public and private education, following the completion of degrees in psychology and special education at Texas A&M in 1997. Additionally, Lydia is a published author in the neurobiological sciences. She received her master's degree in biotechnology in 2004 from Columbia University. You'd think that'd be enough, but this is Lydia. Her passion for learning about the human condition continued even after all that education and resulted in the completion of 2 additional degrees, a bachelor's degree in philosophy, philosophy and English, and a master's in the history of ideas, both through the humanities program at University of Texas at Austin, the Dallas campuses. So Lydia she's served as a regular speaker on the topics of neurobiology, philosophy, and science policy for several Dallas-based organizations. Some of you may remember her from her time on Dogma Debate. Right, I see a couple of fist bumps. Great work there. The Beer and Bible Consortium. I can't remember. I was trying to look up that guy's name. Who's the guy that you just destroyed?
No, it wasn't Ezra.
Oh yeah. Oh, that guy is. I'm not going to say anything. Anyway, are you guys familiar with the Bible and Beer Consortium? Those of you who are not, it's not an organization it's not a part of us, but I like to plug it because I just think it's a fantastic idea and a fantastic thing. And it's put on by a Christian by the name of Ezra Boggs, who's just a fantastic human. But they put together these debates that are quite, academic, intellectual affairs. But they do happen on a Sunday night in a bar in Deep Ellum. So we sit around at the invitation of Christians and debate the big questions, our smartest people against their smartest people, while drinking craft beer. How could you not get into this? And I just think it's fantastic that they put this on and we have an opportunity to participate in it. Bible and Beer Consortium, to me, only works when they have the involvement of our community, because we're the other end of that, right? And so I encourage everyone to come out and attend their events. You can find them online. They are fantastic. And then, of course, she's a regular speaker here at Fellowship of Freethought. She's also a dear friend, and we've watched her grow academically, and we've also watched her grow her family. And this is Dax. Everybody say hi to Dax. He couldn't be here today, but is he not a cutie? Say hello to Lydia Allan, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that welcome. I really, really appreciate it. Last time I did a talk at the BBC, Ezra announced to the crowd that I wasn't aware of this at the time, but apparently I was the first woman that they ever invited to actually debate a man, so on their stages. So I thought that was kind of cool. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today with you all is it's epistemology, and you're probably thinking, what the heck is that? Epistemology is one of the fields in philosophy where we talk about how we gather knowledge, right? How do we know something? And I think this is an especially timely topic because we're now living in the era of Trump, right? So we have, as Kelly Conway has called it, we have alt facts, which I think for many of us, it's very unsettling. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to arm you with 3 questions that you want to ask when you're not quite so sure what's being presented to you. The first question I want you to ask is, what sources of knowledge does the claimant rely on? This is the first thing we're going to talk about. Then I want you to ask, what justifications did the claimant use? Now, I have a friend on Facebook who quipped a joke about this because he said, we're not really living in the age of alt facts or post-truth. We're living in the age of post-justification, and I think that's actually really insightful. So we're going to talk about that. And the final thing I want you to ask is, what intellectual virtues or epistemic norms might the claimant hold to? In other words, why ought I to believe a statement? So those are the 3 things I want you to think about when you're presented with basically what you suspect might be BS. All right, so sources of knowledge. Philosophers since the ancient Greeks have worried about how we get our knowledge. So one of the sources of knowledge that they've carefully looked at is perception. They've also looked at introspection and our memories. Now, if we fast forward to the Age of Enlightenment, these three sources of knowledge are what we would call a posteriori, or perhaps empirical or experience-based knowledge. And one of the things that they worried frequently about was that our senses were unreliable. For instance, they would say, hey, if I peer off into the distance, I see a tree, it looks really small, but when I get up close to it, it's actually really large. And how can I trust my senses if that's the case? So that would be like I said, the camp of empiricism in terms of relying on perception, introspection, and perhaps memory. We have another group of folks, the rationalists, who worried about reason, and this is what we call a priori. It does not necessarily depend on experience. So for instance, Plato famously made an argument about the fact that one of the slaves could do geometry. People were like, how is that possible? Slaves are not very intelligent, and this is what they're thinking back then. Well, he actually demonstrated through a series of questions that if you present the information, then there's a logical way to follow this information to its conclusion. And so that is what we have with reason. A final source of knowledge is going to be testimony. And testimony figures in pretty importantly, especially in ancient documents. It is something that our legal system is built around. But recent research has demonstrated, I think, that testimony is not often reliable. So especially if you're in a situation where you're under duress. So for instance, if you hear a loud bang and you see that there's something in someone's hand, your brain might fill in that gap and automatically assume that it's a gun when it may be something otherwise. So these are some of the sources of knowledge that people think about when they begin to talk about where it is that where's the starting point, right, of reliable knowledge. Now, of course, we are all a group of skeptics, right? So we are sometimes skeptical of the sources of knowledge that people have. And there was, in fact, a group of folks who were so skeptical of knowledge, they were so radically skeptical of knowledge that they basically started at ground zero and said, there's not much that we can trust. I think there are reasons why that kind of radical skepticism is not something that has to be done. I think, for instance, we can talk to each other, and if I see something and you see something and we can both describe it similarly, the chances are probably pretty good. We don't have a good reason to be skeptical of it. But okay, so that's the first question. What was their source of the knowledge? Let's talk about the next question, justification. So there are several ways that we try to justify knowledge once we have begun to gather it in our reason and also in our experiences. Of course, one of the popular ways, right, that we all appreciate is through rational inquiry. And there are many different kinds of rational inquiries that can be had. We have, of course, the scientific method. We have deduction, induction, and abduction. And let me talk about those for just a minute, what they each mean. So deduction is basically a proof. It's like something you would see in mathematics. If A, then B. If B, then C. A, therefore C. That's deduction right there. That's a syllogism. Okay. Induction is what we often see in the scientific process. So induction is, I have observed that the sun has risen every day, well, since I can remember. And so it seems pretty likely, it seems almost certain, in fact, that the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, David Hume famously asked questions about the problem of induction because we don't have any guarantees that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? For instance, something really awful could happen, a giant asteroid could hit our planet, and then, the sun will not rise tomorrow for us, right? There's a third method called abduction, and this is the one that people seem to be the least familiar with, but it's the inference to the most likely explanation. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm walking down a trail and I find a set of bones. And I look at these bones and I think of the possibilities, and I think, gosh, that might be the bones of a dog. That might be the bones of a small dinosaur. Or, I don't know, maybe it's the bones of a flying purple people eater, right? What do you think is probably the most likely explanation of the bones that I came across? It's the dog, right? It seems most likely that it would be a dog because dogs are very common. Dinosaurs are also in that realm of possibility. However, they're much less common, so less likely. And of course, very unlikely that it's a flying purple people eater. Another way of justification is through pragmatism. So pragmatism is a brand of philosophy that is almost uniquely American. It's not to say that other philosophers haven't been pragmatic before, but this philosophy was developed here in the United States by a number of well-known folks like William James and Jane Addams and so on and so forth. And the question that the pragmatist will ask you is, what works, right? Can we justify it because it works? Can we justify it because it's useful, right? And what might be our live options? These are all questions that the pragmatists are likely to ask. So on a pragmatist justification, it doesn't necessarily have to be true by existence. The flying purple people eater hypothesis might be useful to us for some reason. In that case, it grants, in some senses, some truth to it. Correspondence is another way that we justify that something is true. For instance, does it reflect reality, or is it a straight up fact? And we think of this, I think of this as checking against something, right? So if somebody tells me there's a tree outside and it's on fire, right? How am I going to verify or justify that claim? I'm going to go outside and I'm going to look, I'm going to check, and I'm going to see, oh, I see that too, right? I have now lined up their statement. Their statement has now corresponded with reality in some sense. And we also have coherence. Coherence is what I was implying a minute ago. Coherence is the idea that we have a web of beliefs that cohere together, that stick together, okay? So under coherence, the fact that the ideas that surround the idea that we're thinking about justifying, that they cohere and give it strength, is something that adds justification power to the statement we're thinking about. And this is where I think about things like in science when we do peer review, right? If somebody produces a study that doesn't seem to really cohere with what everyone else has been doing in that field, then we are rightly skeptical of it, right? So for instance, Dr. Wakefield came out a number of years ago with a study that says, we think that autism is caused by vaccines. Well, I mean, of course, that study was controversial. It didn't seem to cohere with the evidence that folks already had. And so here we are all these years later. A number of studies have been performed since then, and we have found that his claim was not reliable, right? Okay, so these are all different theories of justification that give you power to think about what it is that you're being told by someone, especially by someone you suspect might be selling you alt facts. All right, the third question is probably the one that people think about the least, but I think it's actually one of the most important things to discuss. And that is the question of epistemic norms, or perhaps intellectual values. And we often think of facts, the creation or discovery in some senses of facts, as something that is done in an objective, values-free way. There are lots of folks who think, for instance, that science is something that we do purely objectively, right? Except that that's not true. We actually have a number of values that go into the process of building information. So there's a couple of ways we can think about the values that we have when it comes to knowledge. One of the most important values I think that all of us in this room share is what I would call the deontological values. Now, deontological is a fancy word for saying duty, right? You have a duty to do something. So an instance of a duty that you might have is, I'm a mother, I therefore have duties to my child by virtue of the fact that he's my child, right? And I think one of the most primary duties that we have in collecting knowledge and thinking about it is the duty to truth-making and truth maintenance. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we get so mad, or at least I do, I get really mad, when somebody presents me information that does not fulfill the duty of truth-making or truth maintenance. It offends me, right? Another way to think about epistemic norms is to think about what we call virtues, right? So virtues are, frequently we think of virtues almost as personality traits. Like we think of somebody as an honest person and that's part of their character, right? Well, we can sort of think this way about information and knowledge gathering too. So what we look at when we look at a person who we think is intellectually virtuous is, do they have good ways of forming beliefs, which would be virtuous ways, or do they have bad ways of forming beliefs, which we would consider vices? So some examples, right, of intellectual virtues might include responsibility, rationality, seeking truth, honesty. Intellectual honesty is a word we use frequently sometimes in internet debates. Avoiding fallacies, and consistency, right? We trust somebody that we know has practiced intellectual virtues, and it makes it easier for us to accept something that they've told us later on. Now, another way we can think about, the third way we can think about epistemic norms is, do the values that the person has lend themselves to the proper functioning or the practicality of the knowledge? So in other words, is it a prudent belief, or is the belief in some sense useful? Again, that stems a little bit from our pragmatic way of thinking about things. But all of these values coalesce in different ways that we interact with each other to help us decide if we think that the person that we're dealing with and the claims that are being made are actually something that is acceptable. Okay? So, the three questions, just to remind you again, that I want you to think about in the future when you're dealing with information as it's being presented to you are: what sources of knowledge does the claimant rely on? And are those sources of knowledge trustworthy? What justifications did the claimant use? And what intellectual virtues might the claimant hold to? So I hope that will give you some tools to put in your tool belt as you progress through life and are good skeptics. Now, with that being said, I do want to open up the floor to questions, because I've given you some really basic discussion on epistemology, and some of you might want to have other kinds of questions to ask about things that bug you, about the ways that people gather knowledge and sometimes misuse knowledge. So I'm ready to take questions. Yes, Janie, hi. Yeah, no, I think that's let me pull this out. I think that's a great question, because I think that kids are actually interested in the ways we gather knowledge, and children will often ask us, why, a million times. And also, if you notice, when we have elementary school curriculum, for instance, we will teach kids the difference between, say, facts and opinions, right? So what I would recommend is taking these ideas, and instead of presenting, let's say, we're not going to use the words epistemic norms, right? We're going to explain it using an analogy or a metaphor for what we think an epistemic norm is, right? So an analogy would be something like lying. What happens to you? How do you feel when somebody lies to you? It makes you hurt, it makes you feel bad, it makes you feel like you've been tricked, right? And then we can talk about what that means. Well, why? What was it about receiving that bad information that made you feel bad? And then we explain to them that's why we're skeptics, because there are people in the world who are frequently misinformed, not always intentionally deceptive, but will present bad information. And we can't make good decisions with bad information. Okay, other questions? Yeah, hey, Jason.
What kind of news or results have come out of neurobiology or neuroscience that calls testimony in courts in question?
I can't list any studies off the top of my head. I'd have to go to PubMed and look them up. However, I do remember as far back as the 90s, I did take a course when I was at Texas A&M, and the course was on, the course centered around eyewitness testimony. It was a psych course that I took. And there are numerous studies that hinge on the fact that what our brains do is our brains cannot take in every bit of stimulus in the environment. If we were to do so, it would be overwhelming. And so what happens is we have a selective amount of material from our environment that actually reaches our brains and our ability to process. And we have evolved to survive. We have evolved to survive, not necessarily to represent inside our brains a picture-perfect, photorealistic presentation of reality. And so what happens is, in order to survive, our brain will take threatening stimuli and will fill in the gap. If we don't know where the threatening stimuli, what it is, we'll fill it in, right? So let's say you're walking along the Katy Trail, and you know the bush kind of rustles, and you jump because you think, oh my God, it's a snake, right? And then you see that it's just a bird, and you laugh at yourself for being an idiot, right? But that's exactly why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, especially in situations of duration and stress, because if you are startled by something, your ability to clearly state what it was that startled you may not. Your brain may have filled in what it was. And this, again, happens. I remember my professor at the time, he tricked us, the whole class, he tricked us. He set up a scenario where somebody came running into the room and was screaming at us and waving something at us, and then the person ran out of the room. And he asked us, what was he waving? And we also heard a very loud bang, and we all thought it was a cap gun, like a pop cap gun. Well, when the guy was asked to come back into, and all of us would have sworn on that. All of us would have stood in a court of law and sworn that we saw this guy waving a pop gun or a cap gun at us, right? When he came back into the room, he had a silver pipe in his hand. It wasn't even the black pop gun that we all thought it was. Different color, different object. All right, other questions? Yes.
What are the? Oh, sorry. We do something similar at Camp Quest, where we do the hoax, and we have somebody come in and steal a cell phone or whatever.
Yes.
But have there been sociological studies done on the effects of what other people's perceptions are and how that affects our memory, as far as because one of the things that we noticed is that when one kid is like, oh, he was wearing a red shirt,
Yes.
then suddenly everybody remembers a red shirt,
Yes.
even though, you know, his shirt was blue.
That's exactly right. So yes, there has actually been a number of studies about that. It has to do with suggestive questioning by the police immediately after an event. So for instance, if the police come in and they say, well, what did he look like? And you say, I think he had dark hair. And they go, oh, was he African American? Yeah, I think he was, right? These kind of like leading questions will, in fact, your brain is kind of primed to try to understand what just happened. And so when somebody makes a suggestion and it seems to fit your information, you'll be like, oh, yeah, that sounds right. Yes, yes, there is. And I think the reason is survivability. You can survive making a false positive, right? You can't survive being wrong. And I think that, like I said, with the bush that kind of, rustles next to you, if you're right and it's a snake, you've just jumped away from being potentially bitten. And if you're wrong and it's just a bird, no harm done, right? Well, at least from an evolutionary standpoint, right? The other thing I want to point out is that we also have studies about the way that individual perception is affected when you're under stress. And when you are in a stressful situation, especially when you're like all the way at the height of fight or flight, your perception physically changes. The size of an object will look much larger than what it actually was at the time that you were experiencing the threat, and so on and so forth. Things might seem much closer. Other ways of perceiving a threat that make it seem even more dangerous than it might have been otherwise, so that your instinct will get you out of there so that you can survive. Suggestible. I think that, again, I think that the human brain is a pattern-making device, and it has a need to fill in the gaps. And if something seems like a reasonable gap and it makes sense to you, then there's a sense of emotional satisfaction, right? That you now have the answer, right? So before, you were scared because, it was just some guy with dark hair, right? And you don't know who that could be. Like, there are tons of guys with dark hair, right? But when the police says, well, maybe it was this guy, and you think, yeah, probably could be that guy, your need for answers in order to protect yourself in the future, right? There's a sense of satisfaction, I guess. Even I hate to use the word satisfaction, but that comes with that. But it's the same sense that we get when we're in a like a disagreement with somebody, and somebody comes to our aid and says, no, she's right, it's this. And you think, yeah, see, this other person agrees with me, so I'm not so wrong. Yes. Hi.
Hi, my name's Diane.
Hi, Diane.
I don't know if this is really along the lines of what you were talking about, but there's a term that I'm hearing a lot lately.
Yes.
And that is cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
And I feel like maybe it applies a lot in this situation where there's a lot of news out there that people either will jump to believe something that is obviously not true.
Yes. So let's think about this from a survival perspective, right? All of us, in some sense, belong to a tribe, right? I belong to this tribe, right? You guys are my secular humanist tribe. And there's a safety in belonging here. And so if I were to receive information from this group of people who makes me feel safe and welcome and who cares about my long-term well-being, that didn't quite match with what I think might be real, I now have to ask myself a really tough question. I'm put between a rock and a hard place, right? Do I go with the thing that I think is probably true and risk, disconnection from a group that I need? Or do I go ahead and find reasons to dismiss the true thing and maintain my place among my group, right? That is what I think the bottom line of cognitive dissonance is. Cognitive dissonance is when you are presented with facts that threaten your worldview or your connections to other people. And if that worldview has served you well, as we mentioned a minute ago, if it has had pragmatic or practical importance, then there are a number of folks who will willingly dismiss even obvious facts in order to maintain their group allegiance or their allegiance to a worldview that they feel has served them very well. Yes.
Internet's full of algorithms that play into exactly what you're talking
Yes.
about, and how do we resist them? How do we put ourselves in a situation where we can hear other facts?
I mean, and that, that's the question. That's the $20,000 pyramid question, right? We're all guilty of cognitive flaws. Like I said, we were not, if you will, I hate to use this word, but we're not designed by nature. We're not designed by nature to present reality with photorealism. Photorealism isn't necessarily going to save our lives, right? So I think that one of the epistemic justifications that I feel is extremely important in the modern, postmodern or whatever contemporary era is this idea of coherence. And in some sense, coherence includes things like corroboration with others, right? So when we're presented with something that we aren't quite sure about, it's tough, but we can try to resist the tendency to dig our heels in and put it down and come back to it, maybe talk to other people we trust about it, so on and so forth. And this is exactly why we have to use something like peer review in science, right? Because when you're in a laboratory and you've spent weeks and weeks and weeks testing something, and your grant money is depending on the outcomes that you have, it's easy to say, I'm just going to make this data. And it's not even always a deceptive thing. It's just more like, you know what, this set of data coheres within my laboratory with what I think is happening, and it looks good, and it's going to get me a publication, so I'm going to produce it, right? I'm going to go, well, so I'm tied to that information. I've invested myself in that information. Peer review allows somebody who ideally does not know you, most peer review is anonymous, although some is not, who does not know you, to look at your information and go, nope, this doesn't work, and here's why. So we think our best opportunity to build the most reliable knowledge we can is to involve other people in it. And that even means sometimes involving people whose ideas we don't like or don't agree with. Yes.
Along those lines, in addition to cognitive dissonance, tribalism, how do you get through the exhaustion, the frustration of, when you're reading the news and it just seems like both sides are so guilty of this, where liberals say this is not true because they're conservative, or conservative will say this is not true because they're a liberal.
Right.
And that's not facts. That's, like I say, it's tribalism.
Tribalism.
It's just, I have such a struggle finding out, well, what is the truth then?
Yeah.
Both sides present good facts, but they're both, saying that no, this isn't true because of who they are, rather than presenting what are actually the facts. So.
Yeah. Now, I think, I do think there's a somewhat good and decent way to go about doing this. And it's the third thing that I talked about, which is epistemic values, epistemic norms, right? Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, which was really phenomenal because he was like an institutional, college professor liberal, and he works in moral psychology and moral philosophy. And he was curious to know why it is that those conservatives always believe stuff that's so dumb, right? And so he went out and started doing research, and what he discovered was that it wasn't that conservatives are so dumb. I mean, there's actually a number of very smart conservatives, right? But it's that they value things that are very different from what liberals value. One of the things conservatives tend to value is authority, whereas one of the things that liberals tend to value is individualness and openness to new experiences. And so when you begin to look at what norms and values underpin how a person puts information in their world together, you can begin to understand why they see the world the way they do with that lens. And it might give you an opportunity to approach them with similar values of your own. Does that fairly well answer your question? I see you're thinking about it.
I just want to say real quick.
Yes, ma'am.
Jonathan Haidt runs an excellent website called yourmorals.org.
Yes, yes.
And with the free questionnaires where you can actually see how your morals compare to the liberal and the
Exactly.
conservative
Yes.
spectrum.
Thank you.
Excellent website.
Yes, exactly. Yourmorals.org is his website, right? There's also a number of other, if you just type in common morals, there's a number of websites that'll pop up. But the great place, like the best place, really kind of the only place you can start with somebody that you don't agree with is with their values. And if you can figure out something that they value that you also value, you can start there. I have a number of girlfriends that are Christian people who would consider themselves to be pro-life. I'm staunchly pro-choice. If you get in my face and tell me I can't have an abortion, you better watch out because I don't put up with that shit. So, but how can I be friends with these girls who believe that, the law should change and whatnot? Well, because we both value human dignity. And the way they talk about human dignity and the way I talk about human dignity, we are able to look at each other and say, isn't it undignified when you tell a woman who's been through the worst possible horror you can imagine, that she's been, her home's been broken into and she's been sexually violated, and now she doesn't want to continue in a pregnancy that will only, traumatize her more. Are you not dismissing this woman's dignity by just depriving her of this choice? And they will frequently say, gosh, you're right. I wish we lived in a society that valued women more and that treated women with more dignity to begin with. And so that's where you begin to start to shift that conversation away from, you better get out of my face, which happens to me sometimes. People will say things to me and I'm like, you better step back because I'm about to unload on you, right? If we can get away from that and get more towards, what do you value? What do I value? How can we both talk about it? You may begin to slowly persuade. That's the other thing. Christian evangelism drives me nuts because they go to somebody in a mall, right, that they don't know anything about, and they'll say something like, do you know Jesus? And I'm like, you don't know anything about me. You don't know what my values are. You don't know what my history has been, right? You're not going to change my mind by handing me a chick tract, right? You don't know anything about me. If you want to change someone's mind, you have to develop a relationship with that person. You have to build on it and eventually talk through what your values are, what their values are, and hopefully come to some kind of a consensus or an agreement, or at least an expansion of what their thoughts might have been otherwise. Okay. Yes. Hey, Brandon. Hey.
Hi, Lydia. Could you share with us maybe some of the useful principles and practices you have for balancing epistemic confidence with epistemic humility?
Yes, that's a great question. So epistemic confidence, right? There's another term we can think of it. We can think of it as certainty, right? When somebody says to you, "I'm absolutely certain that evolution happened," right? I'm absolutely certain that there is a God. And epistemic humility says, well, maybe I could be wrong, right? And what is the balance between those two places? I think finding, and Aristotle was, if we look at Aristotle's ethics were between the two extremes, right, lies the virtue, right, lies the best way or the middle path. And so I do think it is incumbent upon all of us, and all of us are guilty, right, of going to one extreme. Usually that extreme is that you're right, right? Like, I'm certain that I'm right about this. I think we have to start by saying to ourselves, there is a possibility, however unlikely, that I could be wrong, right? And introduce into the conversation some epistemic humility that too will allow you to hold in your mind other people's thoughts or opinions without, holding on to it for just long enough to give yourself an opportunity to digest it. That balance, it takes practice and it takes time. Because what we now have is, and this is true on both sides of whether it's the atheist movement or the Christianity or whatever, or perhaps we'll say like Muslims, right? We do have fundamentalism, and fundamentalism is built around the idea of certainty. And in that sense, it is so arrogant. It is so arrogant for somebody to say, I'm so certain that Allah is the one and only true God that I'm going to kill people, right? Or Christians, I'm so certain that I'm absolutely dead right about the way that women have to be controlled against murdering babies that I'm going to bomb an abortion clinic, right? And we do this too. We have our own, atheist moments of certitude where we look at people and we point at them and we laugh. I'm myself, I'm guilty of it, right? I get angry. I'm human, right? Somebody will say to me some idiotic thing and I'm like, you sound like a jerk, right? Here's my certain statement that you're wrong. I think if we want to change let me just put it this way. If we want to reinforce our own in-group tightness, we're going to use certainty to do it, right? But if we really want to reach out beyond that, if we want to speak to others who are not part of our in-group, right, then we have to put down that in-group certitude a little bit and try to approach with some humility. It's not an easy thing to do, especially for things that are important to us. Thank you. Any other?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, though I came late, I really respect a lot of the arguments you've made here today.
Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment, and then I wanted you to comment on it.
Sure.
Because when you think, when we hear keywords like study, immediately we're like, okay, this legit. Or when we hear words like peer-reviewed, yeah, we got a really objective group around
Right.
here. But I think, like, when I took my classes, my science classes years ago, I used to question my instructors because they would say, like, oh, the cancer rates of esophageal cancer is going up. And then I would say, where?
Yeah.
Are we talking about in the West? Are we talking in America? Are we talking all over? Are we talking a global idea?
Yes.
And
yeah.
the issue I have, because I believe in questioning, as you say, question everything, but peer-reviewed, oftentimes they've come from the same type of institutions, they've learned the same type of facts
Absolutely.
about whatever it is that they're reviewing, and so they even though you may have some deviation here and there, a lot of those peer-reviewed people look alike too.
Yes,
So
yes,
when
that's a
you-
fair statement.
Yeah, they look alike. And so
Yeah, that's a
when
fair
you,
statement.
especially when you're talking about something cultural or you're talking about intellect, there are some people who believe they own that.
Yeah.
So how do you balance the internal prejudices within the scientific community that's always been there?
Well,
Always been there.
Yes. Well, let me put your mind a little bit at ease. We do have entire departments built around philosophy of science and bioethics that are designed to do exactly what you're talking about, that are designed to look at the science that scientists are producing and ask from a place of intellectual expertise and also discernment whether or not that science is good science. And let me give you an example, okay? So back in the, maybe 50s or so, they were interested in studying heart disease, right? It's a common problem. And it's important that we understand it because, people die from it. And so they wanted to produce the best studies they could with the fewest amount of confounding variables possible, right? All of that's good. Does anybody have an objection to reducing confounding variables? Right? No, not so much. So what they did was they decided they were only going to study men because women have a period every month and our hormones are considered a confounding value, a confounding variable. And so what they did was they looked at how heart attacks happen in men, and then they took the sample population and they generalized it to everybody. And I think probably most people in here are savvy enough to know that that didn't work, right? Because women's heart attacks don't look like men's heart attacks. And so there were a number of women who died because the brightest minds of their generation and the most well-trained folks at Johns Hopkins University or maybe Harvard Medical School could not recognize when a woman was having a heart attack. And so you have, feminist philosophers of science who point out these kinds of problems with science. And all of that stuff, again, it involves, in my opinion, if you're going to question the science, first of all, you need to fairly well understand the science. And if you're going to question it in ways that involve underpinnings, philosophical underpinnings, you also need to have some background expertise in that as well. So I do think that there is a set of experts who are qualified to produce scholarship on why science might be good science or bad science. However, the average person who gets on Google and says, I believe that vaccines cause autism, right? That person has not taken the time to learn the science, or perhaps even to learn the philosophy of science or bioethics. And so again, when we ask ourselves, who are we going to trust? I think the answer is to look at the folks in academia who are criticizing the science rather than saying, I'm going to trust my own discernment, which isn't particularly informed. Now, I do agree that being skeptical is a good thing. What frustrates me, and I get this a lot, I come from a very conservative family of very, very Christian people. And what concerns me is that my very conservative family of very Christian people will say things to me like, I don't believe in evolution. And I'll say, let me talk to you about the genetic evidence, just the genetic evidence, nothing else. We don't have to talk about the fossils. We don't have to talk about, any of that, just genetics alone. And I will begin to discuss with them the genetics of things like transposons or pseudogenes. I mean, there's a number of places in our DNA where we find stuff that suggests that evolution is real. And what my cousins will say to me is, essentially, if I boil it down, I don't need none of that book learning. I got the Bible. And it really pisses me off, because if you didn't want to hear what I had to say about the science that I took the time to learn by going to Columbia, then why did you ask me in the first place? If you don't believe that I have any expertise in biology, despite the fact that I worked for a Nobel Prize-winning scientist in the biological sciences, why did you ask me? That is where I begin to lose my patience. It's fine to be skeptical. It's fine to ask questions, but also have some good discernment. And if somebody says, I don't trust scientists, that there's not much we can do about that. We have to go back. We can't convince them with facts. We have to go back to the values and say, what is it about evolution that's so threatening to them in terms of values? Okay. So thank you for having me. I think we're getting ready to have the kiddos come in and tell us what they learned today in Sunday school, right? Is that what we call it, Sunday school? I really appreciate you guys for having me in, and I'll see you soon.